So welcome everybody to our LGBT History Month talk. My name is Barclay Wild and this talk is called Pride and Progress. So, and happy LGBT History Month as well. So I'm going to tell you a bit about my organisation, the Diversity Trust first, and a little bit about myself, my own background, and also just an overview of what I'll cover in the talk this morning. And as I said, there will be time for questions at the end and we'll stop recording the session at that point in time. So we're very much a values-driven organisation. And what that means for us is, we're a non-profit organisation. We've been established since 2012, and we work across the UK doing training, consultancy, and carrying out research. Can people make sure they're muted, please? Because I've got background interruption noise. If you could put yourself onto mute, that would be really helpful. And we very much bring our lived experience in the context of the work that we do. So not only do we all pretty much have a background of working in equality and diversity and inclusion, we're specialists in that, but as well as that, we also bring our own lived experience. And I'll talk about my lived experience in a short while. We work right across all sectors across the UK, so the charity sector, non-profit organisations, as well as in the public sector, so local authorities, education, housing, health, the police, and also the government departments, as well as in the private sector as well. So right across the sectors, right across the UK. And we try to form partnerships and collaborations with other organisations to support them and on a journey around what they want to do in terms of achieving equality, diversity and inclusion. So that's who we are. So I came out as a gay man back in the 1980s, and if you haven't watched it yet, it's definitely worth checking out the It's a Sin series on All 4, Channel 4 with Russell T Davies. It very much echoes the time and place of the experience I was having at that time. The 1980s was a tricky time for a number of reasons. One was we had a difficult time politically. We had a government that was pretty much wanting to stop even talking about LGBT issues particularly. So that was a really difficult time, as well as the impact of HIV and AIDS. And certainly the It's a Sin series does document that really well. So it's really impactful in terms of that experience. So that led me to want to do something about it. So I got involved in HIV charities locally within the region. And that led me into working in health inequalities for nearly 30 years. I started out working in an organisation that became part of Terence Higgins Trust, which is the national HIV charity. And I've also worked with Mind, the mental health charity as well. And I've done a lot of work in other related sectors, so substance misuse, domestic violence, abuse and youth work. And I'm a Stonewall education role model, so I get to go and give talks a bit like today in schools for Stonewall, which is the national lesbian, gay, bisexual and trans charity. And I've won a number of awards for some of the work that I've done as well, which has been really, really something to be very proud of. So what I'm going to cover in the talk today, I'm going to go through a timeline of history and where we've come from, but also a kind of social and political experience as well, particularly of LGBT people in the UK and also globally as well. Look at the difference in the context around the world. And I'm going to particularly focus on the last 5 decades of campaigning and activism. And I'll offer you some practical ideas on creating inclusive cultures at the end of the session. So hopefully they'll be useful, and there will be time for some questions as well. So I'm going to suggest first off then that attitudes towards sex and gender have been really different and varied throughout time and place. And whereas many mainstream and organized religions have viewed sex as mainly being for procreation, depending on when you are and where you are in time and place will really have seen a difference in attitudes towards sex and gender. Just one example on the screen there is the Warren Cup, which can be found in the British Museum. And it dates back about 2,000 years, so 15 BC to 15 AD approximately. It's Roman. It was discovered not that long ago, about 100 years ago, and on it depicts images of a Roman orgy, not putting it any other way, but all the people involved are male. So they're all male, and there are different sides of the cup showing different images. And this would have probably been on display in someone within ancient Rome who would probably have been quite wealthy, because it's a very beautifully sculpted goblet. And I think it would suggest, therefore, that, you know, at that time and place, there were very different attitudes towards sex and gender. So that's kind of ancient history, and you'll see that, you know, things have shifted for us as a lot in recent times particularly, but also there are differences globally and in the different contexts around the world. And I'm going to talk about some of those later. So bringing us kind of a little bit more into the UK context. So one of the most significant pieces of legal change was around the 16th century with King Henry VIII, who passed what was called the Buggery Act of 1533, which made all sexual activity between men punishable by death. And that remained on the statute right the way through until the 19th century. So quite a significant amount of time, many hundreds of years. And although the death penalty was removed, it was replaced by up to 10 years imprisonment. And the gross indecency law that we now know was on the statute at that time was what Oscar Wilde was sentenced to 2 years of hard labour for gross indecency. And what I'm going to suggest in this talk is that there was a shift around this time between what was criminalized, which was behavior, so the act of sodomy, gross indecency or buggery, to what we now understand as identity, and how that shift has happened over time. So certainly, you know, dear old Oscar would have been suffering at the hands of that legislation back in the late 19th century. Interesting fact, criminalization of lesbianism was considered, so sex between women, it was considered back in 1921, but it wasn't included mainly for the reason that women didn't know of the existence of lesbianism. So even the very discussion or mere mention of lesbianism at the time was viewed, that particularly within Parliament, that would have encouraged women to become lesbian, which I think is fascinating. But certainly right away through the period of time when the gross indecency laws were on the statute, from late 19th through the 20th century into the late parts of the 20th century, lesbianism was never actually illegal in the UK context. Has been illegal in other parts of the world, but not in the UK. Then after World War II, there's dear Alan Turing there, of course famous for inventing the Enigma code. And what we saw after the Second World War was a significant rise in the number of arrests and prosecutions of gay men, particularly at that time. And incredibly, you know, we still have conversion therapy that is still legal in the UK, and I will look at that later. But there was a choice that Alan was given between going to prison or chemical castration. And Alan chose chemical castration, which, if you've seen any of the documentaries about Alan Turing, you will have seen the effect that had on him, which I believe, you know, led to his death. But there was certainly a need for law reform at this time. So in the 1950s, there was discussion within Parliament about the need for law reform. And what we know from that time is that the law was considered to be a blackmailer's charter, because blackmail was being used to frame particularly high profile characters at that time, and that was having a really significant impact across the whole, you know, many major parts of the state, particularly in the kind of the judiciary and in the legal settings, and also within parliamentarians and indeed within the monarchy. And so, you know, there was a real need really to kind of address this. Meanwhile, in terms of the experiences of transgender people, really lovely local connections here, both Michael Dillon and Roberta Cowell, who are the first known British trans man and trans woman in the UK to have gender reassignment surgery. The local connection is that Sir Harold Gillies, who was pioneering plastic surgery around the war, and is considered to be the kind of father of modern plastic surgery, both Gillies and Dylan were working at Bristol, and Michael was working with Gillies and wanted to understand both the testosterone treatment that was being used, but also the plastic surgery. And as far as we are aware, that they are both Michael and Roberta the first trans man and trans woman. So in other words, they had gender reassignment surgery and were using those cross-gender hormones, testosterone for Dylan and estrogen for Carol. So as I said, you know, there are important characters, you know, going through history. Alan Turing there on the left, very famous author, Virginia Woolf, who was, you know, really kind of known to have been in relationship with women, particularly Vita Sackville-West. And, you know, she is considered probably the most important modernist author from the 20th century. And Roberta Cowell, who wonderfully was a Second World War fighter pilot and was the first trans woman to go through gender reassignment surgery, as well as a racing driver. So a real fantastic local queero, as I'm calling these characters, and important as well, important contributions. So then we get to Wolfenden. So Wolfenden's report came out in 1957, and it called for that partial decriminalisation of male homosexuality. And I say partial because the age of consent, in fact, was set at higher. It was set at the age of 21, and that legacy lasted right the way through until the very early, the beginning of the 21st century. So because of these high-profile convictions, you know, including Lord Montague of Beaulieu, Wolfenden urged Parliament to consider decriminalisation. And this was in 1957 when this report came out, but it was in fact another 10 years before we saw decriminalisation in England and Wales in 1967, Scotland in 1980, Northern Ireland in 1982, and the age of consent was finally made equal in 2001. So significant 50-year period, really, of law reform. So I want to suggest then, as I said before, that there's a difference between what was being criminalized all the way through 16th to the 19th century into the 20th century. And what I'm going to suggest is more akin to identity. So this idea that, you know, in the late 19th century, the kind of invention of heterosexuality and homosexuality and bisexuality was emerging. You know, people like Freud, for example, were talking about this. And it was shifting from the focus being on behavior and the criminalization of behavior, and through liberation into identity and into the identity politics that we understand today. And there are some definitions, for example, of lesbian, gay, bisexual, as well as asexual, pansexual, and heterosexual there. So there's a shift happening. One of the first times in which that shift was emerging, this had followed in the summer of June of 1969, the very first time that the gay communities, particularly in the United States of America, had fought back at the police brutality that was being perpetrated against the gay community and the trans community in the late 1960s. And the Stonewall riots, which happened in the summer of 1969, really drove the emergence of the gay liberation movement that we have been, you know, recognizing ever since that time. And this led, in the UK context, to the first Pride event in London in 1972, with around 2,000 people attending that event. So you're starting to see going from criminalization through liberation into an identity politics, and where the state is gradually softening, if you like, to the identity of LGBT people. But it's a gradual softening, and there are some bumps in the road, as you can imagine. Here's one of the first bumps in the road. So back in the very early 1980s, with the emergence of HIV and AIDS. If people could pop themselves onto mute, because there's some ambient noise coming through, if that'd be really helpful, thank you. So this emergence then of HIV and AIDS was a significant impact on the gay communities back in the early 1980s. And the response to that was very much driven, particularly by gay men and lesbians at that time, organisations like the Terence Higgins Trust was founded 1982 following the death of Terry Higgins, who was one of the first people that we knew of in the UK to die of AIDS. And a group of his friends gathered together and set up Terence Higgins Trust, and it's now one of the largest HIV charities around, and long been campaigning for the rights of HIV positive people, you know, also access to treatment as well, and big campaigns around the prevention of HIV. And we've come a long way. And this reaction was really because at that time it was felt within the community that we were being neglected by the state, that the government didn't really want to acknowledge the existence of HIV and AIDS and the impact that the pandemic was having on the gay community at that time. So it took a lot of community organising and a lot of lobbying, and indeed, you know, when Norman Fowler, who was the Secretary of State for Health in the 1980s under the Thatcher government, went to the States and visited San Francisco and saw the number of young men that were dying in hospitals then, I think that really did provide a wake-up call for the UK government back in the kind of the mid 1980s and late 1980s. But we did have a slight other bump in the road, which came about in the late 80s, 1987, 1988, and 1989, that period of time. And here's a quote from Margaret Thatcher, who was speaking at the Conservative Party conference in June of 87. You know, children need to be taught the emotional moral values are being taught, and that they have an inalienable right to be gay. All of those children are being cheated of a sound start in life. Yes, cheated. So you have a politics at the late 1980s, at that time, a politics which is pretty much compounded by the pandemic of HIV and AIDS and the gay community's experience of that. And as well as that, it's also a sense of that the community are needing to self-organize and needing to create organizations, and also using activism as a way of combating what was going on through statecraft. And this statecraft led to Section 28 of the Local Government Act of 1988. Now, if you're familiar with contemporary Russian politics, you'll be aware that in Russia, over the last few years, about 5 or so years, Russia has actually implemented a version of this legislation, which the Thatcher government put onto the statute in 1988. And it more or less stops discussion of sexuality, and particularly preventing teachers from discussing same-sex relationships in schools. And it was on our statute for 14 years. It was repealed in 2003. So this legislation, which the wording of is an intentional, a local authority must not intentionally promote homosexuality as a pretend family relationship. An offer of opinion given by Lord Gifford at that time, senior law lord, was that actually the law was unworkable because of the way it was written. It was never taken to court, so it was never tried and tested within the court system here in the UK. And so, you know, there was this suppression of discussion of same-sex relationships. There was a suppression of even discussion around homosexuality. This at a time when there was a pandemic impacting particularly gay and bisexual men in an unprecedented way. You know, it was literally a generation when I had come out of men who were slightly older than I was, who were being decimated by the pandemic at that time. So there was a real need to fight back and push back against that legislation at that time, which led to a lot of activism. So here I am in the early 1990s in London. I was involved in a number of different organisations. Outrage, which was an organisation that Peter Tatchell and I worked at, was very famous for doing quite theatrical stunts. And the reason we used those pieces of theatre and cabaret was to confront what was going on at a state level, but also at a community level, at an organisational level. This, for example, was a protest we did with the with ACT UP London. ACT UP is the AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power, outside of the Benetton store. Benetton at that time were using an image on their advertising campaigns of a gay man who was in hospital, literally dying of AIDS, and they were using his photograph image for a promotional campaign for selling jumpers. So, you know, there was a real anger at what was happening. And so, you know, organizations like Outrage and ACT UP were using theatre and camp and comedy and cabaret to get across really, really important messages. And the reason we use those techniques is that the media love them. And there's me talking to Sky News back in 1991 outside of the Benetton store just off of Piccadilly Circus. So, you know, what was going on was there was a need for this to be put onto the agenda for people to understand what was happening at this time. And one way of doing that was to capture the media's attention and get this on the agenda, because it wasn't being discussed at a state level or a government level. So there was a real need to bring this to people's attention. And Pride, for example, I was one of the directors of Pride in London when the first Euro Pride happened back in 1992. Over 100,000 people came to that event. So, you know, there was a real significant shift in not only the denial of rights, the suppression of rights, the suppression of discussion, the impact of HIV and AIDS on the community. And I think we were rightly quite angry at this time and wanted to do something about it, which led to me and about 60 other people getting arrested. And I think, I was looking at this image yesterday, I am laying down there at the back and I think I can see myself. I might not be right about that, but I think I'm there at the very far right at the back there, just see my eyes and nose. But anyway, I'm in really good company. So you've got Derek Jarman, the filmmaker, who's on the left-hand side there, who sadly we lost to AIDS in the 90s. Jimmy Somerville, singer and musician, Bronski Beat, Communards, and then Peter Tatchell, the human rights campaigner, who's lying there on the right-hand side. So this particular action is a really interesting one. So the government passed a piece of legislation saying that you couldn't protest outside Parliament within a 1 mile radius or you'd be arrested. So Outrage organised a protest around the reform of the law, so around gay law reform, but wanted to you know, challenge and test this legislation. So we went off on a march. There was about, I think about 100 people altogether, about 60 of us led down. And we were on a march and we got to just at the point of being a mile away from Parliament, and we all led down in the road and everyone got arrested. And I had a very sweet moment with my arresting officer. I'd not been arrested before, so I wasn't put into a cell, whereas other people like Derek and Jimmy and Peter were put into a prison cell. They were treated a bit differently. I was sitting with my arresting officer. I got discharged and just had a caution. And I said to the sergeant, the releasing officer, who is the desk sergeant, I said, I just want to thank you for allowing me to have the arresting officer of my choice, because he was really very kind to me, very sweet. And my arresting officer said, and Sergeant, I'd like to thank you for allowing me to have the prisoner of my choice. So there's a little bit of a moment there back in 1991, getting arrested. So some more queeros then. So Lisa Power, Alan Horsfall and Maureen Colquhoun. So Lisa, very much alive and present. So she's been a sexual health and LGBT rights campaigner for many decades. I knew Lisa at that time in the 90s when she was working at Lesbian and Gay Switchboard. She also was the General Secretary of ILGA, the International Lesbian and Gay Association, and she co-founded the Pink Paper, which for very many years was the main news outlet for LGBT issues, when it was actually a printed booklet, printed paper, and also was a founder of Stonewall, the national LGBT charity. As well as that, we worked together when we were at Terence Higgins Trust. She was the director of a policy director. Alan then is sadly we lost Alan in 2012. He's a long-standing gay rights campaigner, and he was one of the founders of the Campaign for Homosexual Equality and was very active right the way through the sort of 1960s and 1970s. And Maureen Colquhoun, she was an economist, there you go, and a Labour politician. And she was also Britain's first openly lesbian member of Parliament. So really important queeros from that period of time. So beam me back to Bristol then. So I arrived back in Bristol, which is my hometown, in 1993. And I taken a lot of the learning that I'd gained from my activism, working with people like Peter Tatchell, and brought that energy with me back to Bristol. And so I immediately set up Outrage in Bristol. I was very active in volunteering on the switchboard, taking phone calls, which were, you know, sometimes really difficult phone calls when you have, you know, you'd had a script that you had to read, when you had what we call a silent caller. So in other words, you were aware that there was somebody on the end of the line, because what we would do after about 10 minutes or so of talking to the person, we would ask them to tap the phone just to know that they were still listening. And I had these calls regularly. So we'd have a script of all the things that we had to say to them. And on a number of occasions, just as the phone was being hung up, I would hear a voice saying, "Thank you." So it was that difficult to even ring a switchboard and even speak to a person, knowing that, you know, there would be no judgment, but the terror inside somebody as they were coming out. And, you know, I think that, you know, there are probably still examples of that today, although thankfully the access to information in the technology and the age that we live in has made a huge difference around that. I was the campaign coordinator for a local organisation called Gay West, which has been running since 1970. I think that's just tremendous. So 51 years Gay West has been going. Was very active in Bath particularly, ran a weekly coffee shop and drop-in for the community, but was mostly older gay men. Obviously that was pre-COVID, so they haven't been able to have those weekly sessions up till this point. I set up Pride West, which eventually turned into Bristol Pride, and I volunteered within our local HIV charity, Aled Richards Trust, and that led me into a role working in the trust for nearly 10 years, and we became part of Terence Higgins Trust in 2000-2001. Whilst I was involved in Aled Richards Trust, one of the very first jobs I had was to set up a youth project. Initially, the conversation was around setting up a gay men's youth project. So this would have been for gay men who would have been the ages 16 to 25. And I gathered a collection of other workers, professionals that were working in youth services who were interested in the agenda, and we collaborated and formed an LGB youth project, which we called Freedom Youth. That was in 1995. Then we merged with a young lesbian and bisexual women's group that was already had existed in Bristol. And in 1996, we were, I think, the first organisation like that, so the first LGB youth charity within the UK to receive lottery funding, and it was a substantial amount. Over 4 years, we had about £140,000. It meant we could employ people, which was phenomenal. And we, you know, we wanted to share that news, obviously, so we were talking to the media. We had no media training whatsoever. And so we had a meeting with a local journalist. I think it was the Western Daily Press. And we went and had a coffee with this journalist, and he was asking us, you know, what kind of activities do you do with the young people? So we were talking about all the different activities we do. And my colleague, you know, mentioned all the different social education projects that we work on and all the different activities. And my colleague mentioned that every summer, you know, we were planning that we were going to have a barbecue and we would celebrate the young people and their families and their friends, and we would invite everyone and have a big sort of annual celebratory barbecue. The following day, that was the headline on the Daily Mail front page: gay barbecues to burn lottery cash. So you live and learn. But this is definitely in the days before we got media training. But, you know, Freedom Youth in Bristol, part of Off the Record now, has been going 26 years. And I believe it is now the longest continually running LGBT youth project in the UK. So something to be celebrating. And interestingly, I was on Twitter yesterday, and we've just last year, following the Black Lives Matter campaign and the horrific loss of George Floyd, we started to run a kind of training program about anti-racism, and that's led by Black colleagues of mine. And they've just recently been doing some work at the University of Oxford at a couple of colleges, St Hugh's College and St John's, and we've been delivering this program around anti-racism, and it's been mainly to students. And I cannot believe, but I will have to say that the Daily Mail have picked this up. So we've been in the Daily Mail again because of our anti-racism training. So I think if you get written about in the Daily Mail, you're probably doing a good thing. So I'm going to beam us then slightly forward now through the 1990s and noughties. So in 1992, incredibly, as recently as 1992, the World Health Organization declassified homosexuality as a mental illness. So up until 1992, homosexuality was a mental illness, and then all of a sudden it wasn't. So obviously there'd been a long campaign around that, and a lot of work had gone into that. But you know, how incredible to think that in most of our lived experience, not everyone here, but most of our lived experience, that would have been the case, that prior to 92, it was mental illness or classified as one by the World Health Organization. Prior to the year 2000, if you were gay and you served in the armed forces, you would have had to have kept that secret. And when someone was suspicious of you or there was blackmail, then you were investigated, and this meant many people ended up in military prison and would lose their entire career, their job, their livelihood, their income, and this led to a number of suicides of serving members of the armed forces. But in the year 2000, the regulations and rules were changed, and so since that time, LGBT people have been able to serve openly in the armed forces. And I believe, I don't have direct experience of this myself, but I believe when talking to people who are LGBT and are working in the armed forces, the culture within the organization is a lot more accepting today than perhaps it would have been previously. But, you know, a lot of work. Then in 2002, the equal rights for adoption are granted to same-sex couples. And what you're starting to see is a shift in the way the state views same-sex relationships. And this leads then on to a number of very positive changes that happen over a relatively short period of time, through the noughties particularly. I just wanted to mention another piece of important legislation and legal change. So I've been talking about the work we do around anti-racism, and a lot of this work has really come from the McPherson report and the Stephen Lawrence inquiry, and has really driven us as an organisation around anti-racism work. But one of the other pieces of work that we do, which I think is vital, is educating around hate crime and the hate crime legislation that exists, and particularly our will and want to encourage people to report when they are the victim of a hate crime. And so we have a statute, we have the Criminal Justice Act since 2003, although there was previous legislation in 1998. But the Criminal Justice Act framework sets out really clearly that where an incident is hate motivated, based on a number of characteristics, including race, disability, faith, religion, belief, gender reassignment, and sexual orientation, so that includes LGBT people, then those cases will be considered to be hate incidents and will be treated as such. And that can lead to enhanced sentencing for the perpetrators. The characteristics of age and sex, I've put them there in different font color because whilst they are considerations, and within Avon and Somerset we do have support for victims who are the victim of ageism and sexism and misogyny, we don't have a statutory requirement, so they're not actually included in the law, whereas the other 5 characteristics there are. So that's the Criminal Justice Act of 2003. So I want to talk next then about gender recognition, and another really important and significant change that happened in the noughties. This was in 2004. So we're now into the, really into the Blair years, the Blair government. And what we're seeing is we were a very early adopter. We were one of the first countries in the world to recognize the rights of trans people, and also give trans people a way of changing their legal gender through what's called a gender recognition panel and a gender recognition certificate. So it's possible for someone who's living full-time and permanently in a different gender to the one they were assigned at birth to actually apply through that process. Now, many trans people don't do this. It's expensive, takes a long time, you have to gather a lot of evidence, your case goes through for a panel that you never get to meet, they can refuse you and deny you your transition, and you can't appeal that. Now, there has been a number of consultations over the last 3 years or so. since 2018 to look at reforming the Gender Recognition Act, but there's been a lot of pushback around that. And so, you know, at this point in time, the government are considering making that easier. And where it becomes a challenge is in the provision of single-sex services, but also in the prison service. So at the moment, the status quo is that a trans person will probably end up in a jail or a prison where that might not match how they present. So a trans woman, for example, who presents as a female, but says a male on their birth certificate, may end up in a men's prison. And there's been some really tragic cases of trans women who have gone through the prison service and lost their lives as a result of that. So that's where we are with the Gender Recognition Act. But, you know, amazing queeros here. So Christine Burns and Stephen Whittle, who were pretty much the authors of the Gender Recognition Act, long-standing trans rights campaigners. They set up an organisation called Press for Change, which lobbied the government, and they were integral in making sure that that legislation was changed. You know, really important, significant people in the trans rights movement, particularly at that time and more recently. Okay, so then I want to go and bring us pretty much up to date next. So where we've been coming from, that, you know, death penalty, imprisonment, gradual decriminalisation, partial decriminalisation, lowering the age of consent, Section 28, bump in the road, big bump in the road, massive bump in the road with the impact of HIV and AIDS, starting to see things softening in the very early noughties. You know, things like the lifting on the ban in the armed services, and also adoption rights being extended to people in same-sex relationships. So we're starting to see that shift happening. And then we've got this time period then since that time. So 2005 Civil Partnerships Act, really the first time that same-sex couples had the ability to protect their relationship, and were pretty much given the same rights as heterosexual people who were also in a relationship as heterosexual couples who perhaps were married. So almost exactly the same as marriage. The fundamental difference between civil partnership and marriage is the word. So for example, in a civil partnership, it's not possible to use the word married or marriage. You can't even have it in a song. So this was in a way to enable the Civil Partnerships Act to pass through Parliament by saying, you know, there is no way that same-sex couples will ever be able to be married. So we can't, you know, you can't even use those words. So that was 2005. Next significant milestone then happens in 2010 when we had the Equality Act. Now, despite there being 116 different pieces of equality law, which are dated over a 45-year period, dating back to the 1960s with the Race Relations Acts and the Sex Discrimination Act in the 1970s and the Disability Discrimination Act in the 1990s. What happened was this was all consolidated. So all of the legislation that related to equalities was streamlined and harmonized at that time. And sexual orientation and gender reassignment, along with a number of other protected characteristics, are protected from discrimination in law. And this is really important and significant milestone in the law reform. Incredibly, it's only since 2003 that you've been protected from discrimination on the grounds of sexual orientation. So I remember in the 80s going to rent a house in Brighton with my male partner, and we were refused because we were two men. So that was happening right up until that law reform. And people probably remember case in 2010 of a same-sex couple, again a local connection, Bristol-based connection, of a same-sex couple who went on holiday to Cornwall. They tried to stay in a bed and breakfast, and the people that owned the bed and breakfast, because of their religious convictions, wouldn't allow that couple to stay in a double room. The same-sex couple then took that case to court, and they won on the grounds of discrimination, because you can't provide goods and services to the general public and say, well, we'll give you a service, but we're not going to give you a service. You can't do that. So that was a really important milestone in the way in which the law was tested. That happened back in 2010. So we're getting closer to something like equality then. So in the more recent decade, so the last decade, things like the Marriage and Same-Sex Couples Act. So now, you know, a good nearly 10 years on from the original Civil Partnerships Act, it's been possible since 2014 to get married. My husband and I got married in 2018 because it wasn't until 2017 that pensions were made equal. That was a bit of a shift over time. So some pensions had been equalised as far back as the Civil Partnerships Act, more recently in the Marriage and Same-Sex Couples Act. But it wasn't until 2017 that there was a final kind of test case where an individual couple, two men, took a case to court and won the rights to enable their pensions to be left to each other. So that really was quite a significant impact at a very recent time. So it's only been in the last 4 years that, you know, we've been actually had something akin to equality. And there are still bumps in the road. There are still, you know, things like the hate crime legislation needing reform. And I would argue that some aspects of the Equality Act aren't perfect and could do with refreshing. And what you find is that case law does a lot of that. So the test cases, like the bed and breakfast case, will go and they'll test out, you know, is this discrimination? Yes, this is discrimination. So then, looking back at Alan Turing, the law passed in 2017, which meant that all of the historic convictions for gross indecency that had been put onto men's records, they could be pardoned for that. Again, very recent times when this has been shifted. And then look at that, Northern Ireland. Same-sex marriage became legal in Northern Ireland in 2020. That's last year. So only since last year. Incredible. So some more important and significant people from our histories, and some very, very up-to-date people here. So Justin Fashanu, sadly, we lost Justin in '98. He played football between sort of 1978 and 1997, and was known very early on to be gay, and had come out publicly, and that, I think, probably led to his, the impact on him, because he was the first professional footballer to be openly gay. I think that led to him, having a really painful time and taking his life. And then we've got a couple of important characters then. So Lady Phil there in the centre, she's the founder of UK Black Pride and director of an organisation called the Kaleidoscope Trust, and Nicola Adams, OBE, who is out and proud and a former professional boxer and a female flyweight title holder from 2019. So more important queeros. There are many, many, many more. I would have been here all day if I'd put in everyone that I wanted to cover today in the talk. So that's the legal context. What I want to talk about next is the social context. And I'm going to argue through evidence that we still have quite a lot of work to do. So as I mentioned earlier, it's still possible to have conversion or reparative therapy to cure you of being gay or lesbian or bisexual or trans. And the UK government in 2018 did a really large sample of about over 10,000 people, and they were researching, and of that sample, 2% of the people who took part in that had been offered reparative therapy. 5% had been offered and 2% had undergone it. And so, it's a really important campaign that we have that law, that we address this, that we actually stop conversion therapies from being legal, because these can be offered. And there was a piece of research published in Therapy Today. This was back in 2009, so it's a little bit earlier, but it found that 1 in 5 UK therapists, so people practicing therapy in the UK, were offering conversion or reparative therapy. 1 in 5 therapists. So, big important campaign around banning conversion or reparative therapy, because I've supported people that have been through this, and it's been horrific, the outcomes it's had on them. The other points I want to draw people's attention to, so one is around people's experience of hate crime, then people's experiences in school. So if you're working with young people, this will be important, and also the experiences of older people. So it's like a life course. So in terms of the hate crime information, so we know there are over 100,000 hate crimes recorded in England and Wales. There are 105,000 hate crimes recorded in the Crime Survey of England and Wales in 1920. And Stonewall did a piece of research, again, large sample of many thousands, I think it was 6,000, or so. It might have been as high as high 6,000s. But they found that when they asked people if they had experienced hate crime because they were, because they were gay or lesbian, so homophobic or biphobic or transphobic, just hate crime, that the number of people that had said yes, but then when we're asked a subsequent question about did you report it to the police, 81% said no. Now, when you look back at data that was published by Stonewall in 2014, it was 75%. So in fact, the numbers of unreported hate crime is increasing statistically. So that's a job of work. So as well as getting the ban in place on conversion therapy, we also need to be encouraging people to report and get support when they're the victims of hate crime. And what are the reasons people say that they don't report? I fear being discriminated against. So people don't seek help because they fear being discriminated against, which is why I would suggest specialist services are really essential. Specialist LGBT services are essential because it means that people then who come from the community will then be able to, understand what people are going through, what people's experiences are, which is why we run the Alphabet's LGBTQ Youth Project in South Gloucestershire. We run that youth project because we believe it's important that there's a safe space for LGBTQ young people. So, leading into the schools examples then. So Metro Charity, again, sample size of around 5,000 young people took part in a survey they ran in 2016. Have a read through those statistics. So as you would expect, I'd imagine, high levels of name calling. So 3/4 of young people were saying that they had experienced name calling because they were lesbian, gay, bisexual, or trans. Nearly half, 45%, had been harassed or threatened or intimidated. This is in school, by the way. And almost a quarter have been experienced physical assault. And what I found really troubling out of that particular data, and Stonewall did a school survey as well, which found very similar patterns, was that a small percentage of the perpetrators of this in schools are the adults, are the staff, the teachers and other adults within the schools. So it's not only other young people that are the perpetrators, it's also some of the adults. So, training, education and awareness of teachers in schools, really, really vital. So that's the experiences of young people. We've just done a project with the University of Bristol called Care Under the Rainbow. And that project was looking at how to build inclusive care homes. We published that back in 2018-19. And the resources and materials are all freely available on the Diversity Trust website if you're interested in looking at that. And what we found was there was a real difference in people's experiences. So for example, some LGBT people told stories about how they felt really accepted within their care home experience and residential home experience, and others said they felt really isolated. And so there's a real big difference. And this Marie Curie survey around end-of-life care found that 74% of people were not confident that health and social care services would provide a sensitive end-of-life care for their needs. So there's a real difference in the way people experience treatment and care. And I was really privileged to interview some older gay male couples in our research process who told us that they felt their relationship was accepted. In fact, one couple in South Gloucestershire in a care home in South Glos told us that they had their civil partnership in the care home, and all the staff and all the residents had gone along to support them on their day and made it a really special day for them. So there is a real difference. And I would suggest, a little bit like the schools example, there are some brilliant schools who are really forward thinking and doing a lot of work around this and have a zero tolerance policy and actually do implement that zero tolerance policy to bullying and harassment, but also similar to the experience of people in care and residential care, that actually it's there are so vast differences in people's experiences, some very positive, some very negative, and many in between. And it shouldn't be like that. We should be creating something that's more of a level playing field in people's experiences. So I want to talk about what I think matters around language and other aspects of language next. And I'm going to start by doing this through looking at what we call microaggressions. And I want to look at the impact of how things like hate and discrimination can have on minority communities. Now, microaggressions for me are often at the intersection of things like sex and race and gender, but they do also translate into sexual orientation, identity, gender identity, and disability as well. And what I'm talking about here, I would sum up as death by 1,000 cuts. So it's the way words are used, the way things are said, the way language is used has an impact. And it's not only the way things are said, it's also how people treat you or react to you or respond to you. It's the way people avoid you. It's the way people exclude you. It's the way people will cross over the road to avoid you. And it's subtle. Like, unless you live it, you don't know it's happening. And often through things like experiences of racism, sexism, ableism, disableism, homophobia, transphobia, biphobia, etc., people's lived experience of this stuff that happens on a daily basis, you can't explain, because you won't experience it unless you have experienced it yourself. It's very much a lived experience thing. But, you know, what starts as a microaggression can escalate, and it can lead into acts of discrimination, and it can lead into acts of hate. And when I look at the data from the hate crime service that we work really closely with, SARI, who I'm sure most people are familiar with, Stand Against Racism and Inequality, when we talk about through our hate crime and education and awareness training programs about people that are presenting to the services, and this is relatively recent data and information, particularly over the last 3 years or so. So the people that are being targeted are from a smallish population or group of people. So people who are from Europe but not born in the UK, people of a Gypsy, Roma or traveling heritage, Muslim, refugee, foreign, inverted commas, and also trans and non-binary people. So people who don't fit into the gender binary, perhaps, you know, they don't look male or female. They identify in a way that's outside of that gender binary in terms of being non-binary. And these communities and groups seem to be the current targets of hate crime. And this is within this area. This is SARI's work that we do with them we work with them across Avon and Somerset. So it's very much local data. And it has an impact. You know, all of this has an impact. You know, it's not necessarily that, you know, violent crime has to happen for the impact of hate crime and discrimination or hate incidents to have on individuals. And it can lead to a whole range of series of challenges, particularly under what I would call minority stress. So where individuals, because of their lived experience, because their lifelong experience of things like microaggressions, growing up in a culture which says you are different, you don't fit in, you are othered, you're not part of our community or our organization or our society or our school or our family, you're outside of it, and so you are othered. And this has an impact which I would argue is that will work under that title of minority stress. So, you know, increased loneliness and isolation and vulnerability as a result. Challenge around identity, you know, because you're being attacked and you're being, you know, picked upon because of who you are. So when somebody is assaulted and it's random and it's in the street, it's very different to when someone attacks you because of who you are and because of the identity that you have. Mistrust, this is a big one for us, you know, mistrust of services. So people aren't going to come and get support. They aren't going to reach out and help seek because they're not going to trust you as an organization. So how do we build trust? So in a sense, there's almost like two pieces of work that we have to do. One is facing towards the community and encourage reporting and encourage help seeking. And the other is facing towards the services and the organizations who are providing that help and support to ensure their cultural competency. And how do you gain cultural competency? You do that through your own life experiences. So, you know, meeting people from different communities and groups is an ongoing job. It never ends. And that's how we all can achieve cultural competency, as well as all those other aspects of self-harm, mental health, eating disorders, suicidal ideation, etc., increased vulnerabilities. So that's the UK. What about the rest of the world? So the International Lesbian and Gay Association, known as ILGA, they publish a map of the world every couple of years. And what they do is they color code it so that it illustrates how that particular state is doing in terms of LGBT law and reform and rights. And so the darker blue you are, the more likely you are to have absolute constitutional protection, which isn't in that many countries actually. So Mexico, Cuba, Ecuador, Bolivia, Portugal, South Africa, Sweden, and I think Nepal is probably one of the other countries. So those countries have constitutional protection of people who are LGBT. So it's written into the Constitution. So we don't have that. What we have is things like the Equality Act, the Gender Recognition Act, and hate crime legislation. So we have protections, but we don't have constitutional protection because we don't have a written constitution. But what we do have is all of those other broad protections in place. So we're in that kind of middle blue. So we're not in the dark blue, we're not in the light blue. So as you get into the light blue, whilst there may be protection in employment, the protection is limited, and the lighter the blue goes, the less protection there is. So for example, you might have some places where there's civil partnership, there's employment protection, some places where there's marriage equality, and also that statewide protection from discrimination. So those kind of countries, you know, Canada, large chunks of South America, Australia, New Zealand, Mongolia, most of Central, Western, Northern Europe, South Korea, and I believe Taiwan, those states have that protection for discrimination, and many will have civil partnership and marriage equality. So let's look at the colours that are neutral tones. So what I'm going to call those is states where there is no legal protection. So there is no constitutional or legal protection from discrimination. There is no same-sex marriage or marriage equality or civil partnership. But you also don't get put in prison. So the neutral tones, you know, places like Russia, Kazakhstan, China, India, North Korea, parts of Central and Western Africa, those countries are, and Southeast Asia, those countries and states have neutral legislation. So they don't protect, but they also don't put people in prison. Then when you get into the countries that are kind of yellow and going into orange, so basically that's criminalization. So the darker the orange gets, the more criminalization. So up to 8 years or 10 years or more life imprisonment. And then the dark brown toned countries, so Mauritania, Nigeria, Sudan, Somalia, Yemen, Saudi, UAE, Iran, Afghanistan, Pakistan, those countries still apply the death penalty. So there are 68 countries around the world where sex between men is illegal still, 45 where sex between women is illegal, and 8 where they apply the death penalty. So a very different picture around the world. And India's a fascinating example. So we, through colonialism, the British took our anti-gay laws over to India. They put them onto their statute, and they were there for, I think, 180 odd years. I think it was 187 years, and then they repealed them eventually. I think it was a year or so ago. So often, particularly through colonialism, old-fashioned legislation that's been taken to places like Middle East and Africa, where those were imported or exported by us into those states. And actually we've reformed all of that, and we've decriminalized, and we've liberated, and we've provided legal protection. Many of those states have stuck. They've not shifted, apart from India, which is a recent emergence. So it's gone from yellow to that neutral tone. So that's the global picture. Oops, wrong way. Okay. So I promised earlier I'd say about what you can do about it. So I've got a couple of slides on that. First, I'm going to offer what I think people can do around LGBT, and then I'm going to look at specifically at trans people's support. And then we'll open up for some questions, and I'll stop the recording. So first up then, looking at the LGBT. So what can people do to support LGBT people? So for example, you know, use of the rainbow flag, internationally recognized symbol of LGBT rights and progress and pride. And, you know, that image is probably something that, you know, still has resonance, even though I know through COVID, the NHS has kind of adopted that symbol. But I think even now, still using that symbol will actually make someone think, actually, do you know what, this organization or this professional are thinking about LGBT rights, and they're probably a safe person or a safe place for me to go to and get help and support. Have a mission statement. You know, be public about what you're doing, you know, celebrate international dates and festivals and events, you know, be public about the fact that you are an inclusive organization, you're thinking about the protected characteristics, and that you're working around equality, diversity, inclusion, and that includes LGBT people. Use positive, inclusive images. I've tried to do that through the slide presentation myself today as a kind of a role modeling. But, you know, there is not an excuse anymore for, oh, I can't find an image. You know, there's hundreds of free images out there. There's a really good resource called the Gender Spectrum Collection, which is an online free resource of images that anyone can access, and all they ask for the Gender Spectrum Collection, and it's images of trans and non-binary people, different races and ethnicities and abilities in different environments, like in education, schools, etc. All they ask for is that for you to credit them in the same way as we would do if you were sharing our resources and materials. Use inclusive language. You know, for many years I was saying, why can't we just say partner? And of course, now I'm really happy to embrace the fact that I'm married and have a husband. But, you know, it's about thinking about language, and maybe if you don't know, ask. You know, if you're not sure about someone's pronouns, or if you're not sure what words to use, people are really generally okay with you asking. And it's like, if you make a mistake and get it wrong, just say sorry and try not to make that same mistake again. Intention is really important in all of this. So if the intention is good and it's around learning, people aren't going to have a problem with that. Challenge homophobia, biphobia and transphobia whenever you experience it, as long as it's safe for you to do so. You know, I don't want to put people at risk, but, you know, calling out culture, challenging culture within organizations is a really positive step. Talk to the people who are LGBT, ask them, you know, ask staff and clients and service users what they think needs to happen, what they think the changes need to happen to make sure the organization is becoming more inclusive or is evolving as an inclusive place and practice. Promote those LGBT events. We're in LGBT History Month in February. We've got Pride Month coming up in the summer. You know, there's International Trans Day of Remembrance, Transgender Day of Remembrance in November. You know, there are so many Ida Hobbits coming up in May, International Day Against Homophobia, Biphobia and Transphobia. There are so many different events throughout the calendar that you can use to profile by Visibility Day. There are so many different events, so make sure that you use them. Display and distribute information about any community organizations and groups. And if you're unsure, just hit a search engine. You know, there are many organizations out there. If you're unsure, just use some searches. We've got a whole list of resources on the Diversity Trust website on the links pages. So if you want to access any materials, you can use that, but there are many other examples out there. And my final point on this one is engage. You know, have conversations and discussions, consult, inform and engage, because through that you will see that it impacts into the cultural competency of the organization by actually bringing in those conversations, bringing in people with lived experience. Talk to us. You know, we are out there. We do a lot of work with a lot of different organizations around this topic and many other topics as well, relating to equality and diversity and inclusion. So what about trans support then? So what about supporting for support for trans people? Well, I would use the trans flag. You know, for almost every single identity relating to LGBT, there will be a different flag. So go and Google LGBT flag. Sorry, I shouldn't have said Google. Use a search engine to search out any LGBT flags. Respect for people's genders. You know, don't be assuming or stereotyping. Really important around trans people. Pronouns matter. You know, I use he, him and his pronouns. So it's really important that people do respect people's pronouns. And, you know, again, on the stereotyping, trans people come in many variations and appearances. We did a project a while back with a client in the health sector, and you know, they had produced this leaflet in the design stage, and they were consulting around it, and the images were really, really stereotypical. So it's thinking about how, you know, be representation, you know, be representative, but don't go through stereotypes or tokenism. So there's a very fine balance, and how you mitigate that balance is to involve, inform, consult and engage. And if you have the option to provide gender neutral options and choices.